Good morning, everyone. Hello. Happy that you decided to join me this morning. This is a topic I think is really important, and I assume that you all think it's important too. I always like to set the standard of getting started right away, and so I'm going to go ahead and do that. In addition, I do have quite a bit of material to cover, and I want to make sure that I try to do it justice at least try. Lost my Zoom. Here we go. Okay. This is our learning community, our cessation learning community call. For those of you who have not met me before, my name is Jim Pavlik. I'm the Senior Program and Policy Analyst at the Behavioral Health and Wellness Program. We are inside the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Colorado Anschutz Medical Campus. And we're TA providers for cessation. And so you all have tobacco programs, and I hope that you all have cessation components. It is through cessation that we see the most immediate public health gains. Even your prevention and control efforts should have at least some consideration for the role of its impact on cessation. And if you don't know that, or if you aren't thinking about that, please reach out and talk to me anytime. I'm happy to help. I'm happy to just be if nothing else, a sounding board for your ideas. With that being said, I'll move forward. I don't have any conflicts of interest to disclose to you. I work at the university. I don't take any money from big pharma or from big tobacco cessation or from big tobacco. So to the extent that I share any opinions today, you should know that they're mine and not paid for by somebody else. And with that in mind, they are mine. They're also not BHWPs necessarily, and they're not, of course, they're not part of the university's opinions or any of its subcomponents. With that being said, I'm going to dive right into the content. And when I do that, I'm going to go ahead and, well, no, I'm not going to stop my video. I was going to think about stopping my video, but I'm not going to. I want to be able to see you if you want to turn your cameras on, and then you can, and as an encouragement for that, I'll let you see me too. So why is this important? Why do I think this is a big deal? Well, specifically, I think that we all think that drug use is a big deal. Drug use, there's a lot of it. Drug use causes harms to the individual, and then ultimately causes damage to any community that member is a part of, including their families, their workplaces, and their broader communities, of which we are all a part. And so this is obviously, I'm not breaking new ground here when I say that this is a public health concern. And nicotine plays a specific and special role in the larger drug use category. I don't think that we should be separating and putting in its own little silo. When we're thinking of drug use, we need to be thinking of nicotine use. For one thing, nicotine use precedes for almost everybody who uses drugs, nicotine use preceded the use of that drug. And even if we wanted to just concentrate on that drug is opioids or cocaine or methamphetamine, and we want to understand it, and we want to understand it so that we can treat it. The weapons at our disposal, sorry for the triggering language, is to understand all of the thoughts and emotions and behaviors that are associated with that drug use, and that includes their other drug use. So if we really want to treat cocaine use disorder, well, stimulant use disorder, cocaine, if we want to treat opioid use disorder, if we want to treat cannabis use disorder, we have to understand how that person is using nicotine. How does that person subjectively experience the interrelatedness between those two drugs? And then we need to treat the dependence on both of those drugs. That's the full version of that. So it's first, and it's commonly co-used. We have to treat both. I do like to point out that the citation here is from 30 years ago, and I'm not normally in the habit of citing 30-year-old studies for any reason, even for contextual ones. It just so happens that we don't know a lot about polysubstance use, specifically in its association with nicotine or tobacco use. Our national surveys generally, or most surveys in general, if they're surveying drug use, don't even survey nicotine use or tobacco use at all. Our best survey on drug use in America is the National Survey on Drug Use and Health by SAMHSA, and it does count nicotine, but it only counts what's called concurrent use. Concurrent use means past 30 days use. I'm so happy to hear all those doorbells. I mean, so many people are joining, but it's also very distracting. I should have turned that off. Anyway, it only measures concurrent use, which it means past 30 days use. So the survey will say, here's a list of drugs, check which ones you used in the last 30 days. So if somebody says yes to marijuana and yes to alcohol over the last 30 days, if they had a drink on March 1st and they smoked a joint on March 29th, okay, sure, that's potentially a problem, but it's not the problem of polysubstance use in the way that we normally care about it. What we're normally concerned with is what's called sequential use or simultaneous use. Those are measuring different things, sequential and simultaneous, but those are the drug use patterns where the two drugs are in the body at the same time. Concurrent use can be a good proxy. It's a decent proxy for that, especially once we moved into the category of individuals with use disorders. Because once we get to the use disorder category, daily or near daily use of one or both substances starts to be more and more common. But straightforwardly, it's measuring something that we're not as concerned with. Also, all of our national surveys, or I should say none of our national surveys, survey individuals in group living situations. They're not surveying people in jails and prisons. They're not measuring people in residential psychiatric facilities, which includes residential substance use facilities. And in residential substance use facilities, polysubstance use is extremely common. The number one thing that people end up in substance use treatment facilities for is alcohol. It's a very common drug in society at large, and so you would suspect to see a large number of people in treatment for it, and it's easily the biggest class in most substance use treatment facilities. And 80% of individuals with alcohol use disorder also use tobacco. So polysubstance use, straightforwardly, is extremely common, and we're not studying it in the places where it is the most common. And so we just have to know that data justice is health justice, and so we're delivering a potentially fatal injustice to a big set of individuals out in society who are using drugs. So this is the category of drugs that I will sometimes be referring to as the quote unquote more serious drugs. And I think that most people agree with that sort of interpretation, although I want to be really clear that all drug use is serious, or at least all drug use is potentially serious. These are just the drugs that we tend to put into that category because the harms from them are disproportionate to the number of people who use them. And so like heroin use, for example, or combined with prescription opioid misuse, it's an extremely small part of the population, and it's the second. It is the cause of the second highest or the third highest number of drug deaths per year. So disproportionate to the number of people using, and immediate. The deaths from these drugs are in the short term, right? So we think of these as the more serious drugs. So excluded from this list of otherwise drugs that are illegal federally is marijuana, right? And the reason I took it off this chart is not because I want to ignore it, but just so I can show you what it's going to do to this chart. I want you to be able to see and appreciate the scale there. And this is what adding marijuana does to that chart. It just makes the rest of that chart completely illegible. The gap between marijuana and methamphetamine is absolutely huge. It's about 38 million more people are smoking marijuana more than the next most popular drug, which is methamphetamine. Which is why I took it out that chart. But just to be clear, if we add alcohol and tobacco, that's what they do to marijuana, right? And so now tobacco is 3 times less prevalent than alcohol and causes the first highest amount of deaths by drugs every year. About 500,000 deaths from tobacco every year, about 190,000 deaths from alcohol every year, and about 80,000 deaths from opioids last year. So just to give you a sense of the scale of harm coming from the scale of use. And just for funsies, I decided to add caffeine to this chart. Oh, but it's not on. I thought I added caffeine here. Oh, there it is. There's caffeine. And so again, about 94 to 95% of all Americans over the age of 12 years old are using caffeine. And again, completely just dwarfing all of the drugs. And we're just never talking about this drug. I keep saying that nicotine is the first drug of use for most people, but in fact, we are not measuring caffeine at all, or its role in some of the biological mechanisms that I'll be talking about further down the line. So just look at that as another potential data injustice issue. All right. So if you go back to that first chart, the one that said serious drugs, quote unquote, serious drugs, what I did here was in blue are the percentages of each of those bars of individuals who use those more serious drugs who are also using tobacco, actually specifically smoking in this regard. So you can see it's about 70 to 75% of individuals who are also using methamphetamine, misusing prescription pain relievers or cocaine. It's about 70% or to 75% in that category. It's about 80 to 90% of individuals using heroin and about 50% of individuals misusing prescription stimulants. Going back to the data justice issue, no data at all that I could find on co-use of tobacco with hallucinogens, tranquilizers, or inhalants. But you can see that once we start with the population of drugs, of people who are using drugs that we call serious, co-use is the norm. It is absolutely the way that people use these drugs, right? It's anywhere between essentially 50 and 90% of all of these individuals. And that's not counting how many of these individuals drink. So how many people who are currently gray here, so they're theoretically only using methamphetamine, how many of them drink? Well, I didn't go and look for those numbers, but we can speculate, and I can go find them later, that is probably close to 70% or more. And that's going to be true across these drug categories. How many of these individuals who are, say, using methamphetamine supplement that with a party drug like MDMA? A party drug, sorry, I should put that in quotes. So if we're only considering nicotine, we need to understand that polysubstance use is the norm among the users of drugs that we are often most concerned with. Why? Why do so many people who use drugs use more than one? So there are 4 big explanatory features, and you see the word theory on here. It seems to imply that maybe one of these is more explanatory than the rest. They're all explanatory to some degree. And I can't go into any of them in great detail, but I do want to just sort of briefly overview them with emphasis on the bottom 2, because it really explains why nicotine has the special role in this that it does. So almost everybody here has probably heard of the gateway effect, or the gateway theory. And the gateway theory is essentially that it was developed at a time when smoking was the way that people took in nicotine predominantly. And so the idea was that, kids smoke. Smoking is the first drug that they encounter, or nicotine is the first drug they encounter and then they do it by way of smoking. And that alone was powerful enough, right? I'm sorry, I'm going to quickly do my, I sometimes fail to take attendance, and then then it's bad. It's bad for everybody. So I'm just going to see who's here real quick. All right. Thanks. All right. So that's the gateway theory. Smoking's first, and then here's the empirical facts related to that. When somebody smokes, they become more likely to experiment with more drugs than somebody who does not smoke. They become more likely to use regularly one or more of those drugs than somebody who does not smoke. And they're more likely to develop dependence on any one or more of those drugs than an individual who does not smoke. So across the board, from experimentation to use to dependence, smokers are just more likely to fall victim to this pattern, right? And there is in the gateway theory sort of a traditional pattern where people move from more socially acceptable drug use to less acceptable drug use. So they start with smoking, which back when this theory was articulated was extremely common, especially in middle schools and high schools. And then they would progress to cannabis, which of course prior to medicinal marijuana and recreational marijuana, all in quotes, that would be, so we're near where they would start experimenting with alcohol and then potentially moving on to other drugs. And what those other drugs were has always changed with the time. So sometimes it was ecstasy, and sometimes it was cocaine, and sometimes it was opioids. And right now we're mostly concerned with that opioid pathway. So that's more of a descriptive theory. You can't deny the descriptive power of the gateway theory. It really matches the empirical evidence. Common liability theory starts to move us upstream into the root causes of drug use. Why do people use drugs? Not just that, like, they smoke cigarettes and they magically just have cocaine in their rooms or something. This is getting us to the sorts of personal or psychiatric damage that leads someone to experiment with drugs, find them an enjoyable or an escape, and then continue to use them until they develop a dependence. So I put trauma in here, but honestly, we can put poverty, anything that's associated with poverty, like housing or food insecurity. Eventually, we may be able to more firmly put genetics in this category. But the idea is that this common liability leads to higher probability of using nicotine, also leads to independently a higher probability of using cannabis, and independently might lead to higher use of opioids. And because any of these are independently affected by that thing in the middle, also then leads to higher probability of dual use. And what's nice about this is that the gateway theory can't explain why some people don't smoke but do cannabis. They can't, or don't smoke but do drink, or don't smoke but do opioids. There are some of those people out there, and the gateway theory can't explain it. The gateway theory also doesn't really speak to the fact that there was drug use before Western Europeans encountered tobacco, and that in other countries, kids don't smoke first, they do other drugs first. But this can get us to something more like that. I want to give the gateway theory a new life, though, and that's through these next two mechanisms. That smoking is special. Or I'm sorry, I say smoking. Nicotine. Nicotine is special. Now, the first one is priming, and priming is kind of complicated, but I think all of us mostly understand like drug cues. People who use drugs regularly, say they regularly use a certain drug with their friend Sam. That way, when Sam comes in the room, the brain always immediately goes, "Oh, maybe that drug is here," right? So Sam is a cue for other drugs. That's the sort of psychological link, the association between Sam and the drug. What's happening cognitively in the brain when that person sees Sam? That's what we're talking about with priming. And so what happens when Sam walks in the room is a bunch of stuff, not all of which has been studied or studied particularly well yet, but we're working on it. And one of the things that happens is the brain suddenly becomes less future oriented, right? It becomes pleasure seeking, and the pleasure seeking must happen now. So the brain reallocates its energy to focusing on the present, focusing on the environment, and it does what's called future discounting. It just says tomorrow doesn't matter. That's one example of a prime, right? So where dual use comes into play here is when Sam isn't the cue, but the other drug becomes the cue. So every time you smoke a marijuana joint, you do what's called a cigarette chaser, right? 60% of marijuana users do this cigarette chaser thing, right? And there could be any number of reasons for that. I have theories. I think other researchers have theories, but that's pretty common. So what happens is when you smoke a marijuana joint, your brain reallocates its attention to where is the cigarette and how can I get it, right? And that's how cross priming works. And then it can go the other way, right? If you smoke a marijuana joint and then you smoke a cigarette afterward, then what might happen, and does happen to some people, is that the cigarette then becomes initiates those priming activities for marijuana or cannabis. And maybe that is okay. I don't think it is. Otherwise, I wouldn't be talking about it. Smokers or nicotine users tend to use nicotine throughout the day. So maybe you used to have a rule as a marijuana user: I don't smoke before 3 p.m. or I don't smoke right before bed, whatever it is. But you smoke all the time. But if smoking starts priming you to have marijuana, then maybe you start having a joint right after your morning coffee. Because yes, when you smoke your first cigarette of the day, right? So they become linked. And nicotine, so this gives nicotine a special role because nicotine is more frequently used. I've talked about the biology of nicotine and nicotine use in other learning community calls, but because of the frequency of its use, the way it's metabolized, we use it more frequently throughout the day. So if you're primed to co-use any drug with nicotine, the chances you're going to use it more and more regularly go up. Tolerance is a lot easier to explain. When you take a drug, the drug causes the release of various neurotransmitters. And we'll talk about dopamine so we can be less abstract. Dopamine is a leading culprit here. It is the leading neurotransmitter that leads to pleasure and reward and all those things. So you take in nicotine, you get a bunch of dopamine. The first time you do it, your brain goes, oh my gosh, I love it, but that was too much. So I'm going to do two things so to prepare myself for next time. Number one is I'm going to make more dopamine receptors because I couldn't even handle what you just did to me. So I'm going to make more dopamine receptors so I can physiologically handle it better. And I'm going to lower the receptivity so that I don't get completely knocked out of whack, right? It's the fancy term here is the brain is seeking homeostasis. The brain just wants to do its own thing. It doesn't want to get completely knocked for a loop. So it makes these adjustments so that the next time it encounters nicotine, it won't feel quite so much of it. The problem is, and the reason why nicotine is special here, well, the two things is nicotine's first. So nicotine's the first time you're going to get that surge of dopamine, create those two physiological differences in the body. Then the next drug that comes along, maybe marijuana or maybe it's alcohol, also causes a surge of dopamine. And your brain goes, oh, I've had this before. It doesn't care that the source this time was alcohol. It just knows that it's dopamine, and it's prepared to take in dopamine because it made all those additional neuroreceptors, and it lowered their sensitivity, which means that the smoker, can now take more alcohol, physiologically accept it, and process it in a way that the non-smoker can't, and they'll need more of it to feel the same way as their non-smoking friends do. So they're essentially walking into a novel drug experience as a person who's already more tolerant of it than a non-smoker. They're already a step further on the pathway toward dependence. And the other, so nicotine's first makes nicotine special in this regard. But I think the more important thing here is that nicotine doesn't cause the release of just dopamine. Nicotine causes the release of serotonin, GABA, glutamate, and norepinephrine, all neurotransmitters that when they get into the body make us feel good in different ways. And so it doesn't matter which drug comes next. The smoker is going to walk into that experience a little bit more tolerant of it and requiring a little bit more of it to get the same experience as their non-smoking friends. So they're just a little bit further along the pathway to dependence on all drugs before they've even tried them. And that's what we mean by cross-tolerance. And that's an area where we are desperately overlooking the role of nicotine in, say, our opioid prevention efforts. Okay, one final thing that makes nicotine special, and it's that nicotine, and if you've heard me talk about nicotine dependence before, nicotine is because of all those neurotransmitters and because of the way that we use it, we can use nicotine, the human body can use nicotine to quote unquote solve a lot of issues for us. It's a stress reducer, it's a relaxant, it's a stimulant, it increases attention and focus, it causes euphoria, it does all of those things, and it does it precisely. An experienced smoker can use a cigarette to relax in the evening or wake up in the morning. Same drug, different doses, different effects. So we use what's called a cost-benefit analysis, and the short version of this is drugs do good things, right? All those things I just listed, and drugs normally have, let's say, immediate consequences. Over time, all drugs have significant, like chronic consequences. But in the short to medium term, all drugs do good things and all drugs do bad things. And so we'll call those our benefits and our costs. When a second drug is entered the mix, and when you see those two drugs being used frequently together, there is a reason that can be explained this way, right? So the second drug makes the good things of drug one better, or it makes the bad things of drug one less bad, right? So the classic example here is smoking and drinking. Drinking, it reduces social anxiety. It makes you feel good. It relaxes you. There's a sedative effect, right? The problem is the more you drink, the more sedative it gets. And eventually you can't talk right, you can't see straight, you can't walk. However, and we've seen this, not DHWP, but drug researchers have seen this in the lab where they've given drinkers some reflex and cognitive exams, and they've given those same exams to drinkers and smokers, and the drinkers and smokers outperformed them on cognitive exams and reflex tests. So can you drive home after you've smoked, after you've drank just because you smoked? Absolutely not. The sedative effects are way too strong to make driving safe just because you smoked. But can you drink more and can you drink longer when you smoke? Yeah. Right? So that's the kind of combinations that we should be on the lookout for whenever we see common patterns of polysubstance use. And that's what I'm going to do in just a few more slides. This is the general picture that SAMHSA gives us of polysubstance use in America. 43% of Americans use one drug. And when they use one drug, that drug is almost always alcohol. To a lesser extent, tobacco shows up down here. So there are about 30% of people who use tobacco also don't drink, and you can imagine a significant number of them are down here in this orange wedge. About 8% of individuals over the age of 12 both drink and smoke, and so they're going to make up a pretty big chunk of that 14% of people who are in that light blue wedge, just two drugs. They don't do anything else. Legality matters here. All sorts of things push people into one of these directions, but the legal drugs tend to be used more frequently. And you've already seen that on the big chart where caffeine, alcohol, and tobacco are the top three drugs, and then the drug that's quasi-legal is the next biggest drug, right? So you can imagine that just smoking and just drinking are in that light blue wedge. And then you can imagine who's in that dark blue wedge, because we saw a chart of it, right? All of the smokers who are also using cocaine are also probably drinking. Not all. That's a tautology. That's ridiculous. But this is the general picture. This leads us to about 32% of Americans use three or more drugs. That's a lot. And if you only think about people who use drugs, just get rid of the green wedge from this chart. That means that 43% of all drug use in this country is polysubstance use. That's a big number. It's not half, but it's more than a third. It's something right in the middle, right? It's a big, big number of when we think of just drug use. And the problem here is that in addition to cross-priming and cross-tolerance is that we get cross-dependence formation. When two or more drugs are used together, we say sequentially or simultaneously, but even at this point, concurrently, you're more likely to develop a dependence, not on one of them, but on both of them. And if you develop a dependence, and you'll develop that dependence more rapidly, you'll progress through the stages more rapidly. And once you have dependence settled in, it's more persistent. So we see that individuals who use tobacco have a harder time leaving their other drugs behind, and individuals who have another drug dependence have a harder time leaving tobacco behind. So again, when we've moved out of our prevention space, and we're talking about our cessation space. If we want to increase tobacco cessation, we need to have better AUD, SUD treatment services, and vice versa. If we want better opioid recovery, we need to make sure that nicotine is involved. It's just that simple. We know from various meta-analyses that on average, there's a 25% boost in long-term recovery from another substance if nicotine dependence is treated at the same time. And that varies by drug. So with opioids, it's not a 25%. It's not a 25% bang for your buck, but with cocaine, it's way more than that. It's a much bigger bang for your buck because they're working on very similar stimulant-based systems. But in any case, if we want to, this is a good argument for you guys to be engaging with your substance use treatment folks, right? Because they need you and they need your expertise. Co-use with cannabis is high. It is estimated that anywhere between 70 and 80%. I'll change this number a little bit and say in some cases 60% or more of individuals who use marijuana also smoke. And this is before we get to use disorder. This is just average. Like I said, about 60% of marijuana smokers alone admit to using the cigarette chaser. That's not counting the amount of people who use blunts and splits, right? Blunts, for those who don't know, that you take a cigar, and a cigar is a tobacco leaf stuffed with shredded tobacco. You take the shredded tobacco out of the tobacco leaf and you refill it with marijuana. That's your blunt. And a spliff is just a joint that has both marijuana and tobacco leaf rolled in it. Those are both extremely common, and blunts in particular are getting more popular as time goes on. So co-use with marijuana is extremely high through one of those three methods. And I've already mentioned that dependence is far more likely to develop. And you can see here that it's a 3.6-fold increase in the development of dependence. So nothing to ignore, right? And we can suspect marijuana use is, we already know that marijuana use is going up. It's getting more accepted, it's getting more socially acceptable. In addition to use going up, what we're going to start seeing is that use is going to be prolonged. It used to be that we didn't have a lot of chronic health measures for long-term marijuana users because most marijuana users stopped using marijuana in their late 20s or 30s. But a lot of that had to do with like professional risk and social acceptability. But both of those are going away under the legalization regimes. And so we're going to start seeing people using regularly into their 40s, 50s, and 60s. That'll give us some public health weaponry in the terms of we'll start seeing health outcomes. But to the extent that it's tied to tobacco use, we're going to see this problem increase as well. So what I did here is I divided the harms of tobacco between those that where nicotine is the reason, like nicotine special powers is why we see them show up as a co-use pattern, say with marijuana, later opioids. And then the next slide will tell you the things that the harms of marijuana that cigarettes make worse, or that tobacco makes worse. So here are some known harms of marijuana. And these are immediate short-term harms for the most part here, right? It impairs memory, concentration, learning, and attention, lowering IQ, and impairs driving. Immediately, from the same effect I've already described with alcohol, nicotine alleviates or responds to all of these things, right? So, because lower IQ is sort of tied, it's like the more long-term damaging version of the first bullet point, but nicotine is a focus-enhancing, attention-enhancing drug. That's specifically one of its main like uses and quote unquote charms. And so if you're in a situation where, man, like you love marijuana, but it makes you kind of dumb, it makes you like look away, it gets you distracted, you can't carry on a conversation, you can chase that joint with a cigarette and regain some of that lost ability. And when I say that it alleviates impaired driving, again, I just want to be really clear, it does not make driving safe, but a person can subjectively think that the cigarette makes them more aware. And we see this all the time, right? People, they'll get too drunk. They're like, I need a cup of coffee before I drive home, right? They're wrong. They just should not drive home, but they think that, right? So that's what we're describing here, that this responds to an interrelatedness aspect. And so they're using it to respond to this deficiency, but not actually getting from it what they think they are. And then finally, for a lot of people, using marijuana, using cannabis increases anxiety or depression. And in my experience, in my reading of the literature, it's anxiety more than depression, but to some extent both. And we already know that people self-medicate both of these conditions by nicotine use. So this is why you see co-use as high as you do. And this is the potential problems for it. Now, we've already talked about the role in dual dependence. When people are smoking both of these products, we are going to and do see an increase in asthma and other respiratory conditions. And it's worth pointing out, because we live in Colorado, and so our recreational marijuana scene is, of course, extravagant, and there's a lot of diversity of products and stuff like that out there. And so we can be misled to thinking that everybody's like drinking marijuana or cannabis sodas and eating gummies. But in reality, nationwide, 80% of everybody who used marijuana last month smoked at least some of it. And so and among tobacco users, it's 80% of all adults. It's vaping a lot for for individuals under 25. Young adults and adolescents are vaping more than smoking, but overall, it's still 80% of all tobacco use is through smoking cigarettes, and 80% of all marijuana use is smoked as well. Both of these products are independently associated with lower birth weight, preterm birth, and stillbirth. And then this last bullet point, increased risk of myocardial infarction and stroke. That is, we know that for sure with tobacco. There's no question there. There are different studies that support different conclusions as it relates to marijuana. But the most recent one, which was published earlier this month in JAMA, I'm sorry, might have been in the New England Journal. It's one of those two, did find this connection. So that's why I wrote potential here. It could be a potential additive effect. It looks actually to be a multiplicative effect. The problem here is that because so many people who use marijuana at the rate that would put them in this risk category, most of them also smoke cigarettes. So it's just hard to statistically distinguish them one from the other and then make firm conclusions about what their actual increased level of risk is. So short version is, bit lower data set means more statistical noise, harder to come to firm conclusions, but the risk is potentially there. And at least with smoked marijuana, we would absolutely suspect that this is the case. A lot of these types of risks, cardiovascular risks, are associated with the aromatic hydrocarbons that are found as a product of combustion. And if you're combusting marijuana, you're still getting those aromatic hydrocarbons. So we'll talk about aromatic hydrocarbons in just a second, right after this slide. So these are the things that opioids do that cigarettes, or in some cases, we're talking about nicotine here. In the bottom one, we're talking about cigarette smoking in particular. So nicotine is a euphoriant, so are opioids. Both of these products have pain relieving qualities. Obviously, opioids are pain relievers by nature, but there is a suspicion that a lot of people who are chronic smokers, who develop chronic smoking earlier, are also suffering from chronic pain that they are subconsciously treating through the acute pain relieving effects, known acute pain relieving effects that cigarettes have. This leads us to the third bullet point, which is this fancy word here at the end. That's just a fancy word for increased pain sensitivity. This is a really tragic and ironic consequence of using opioids for a long period of time, is that you actually increase your pain sensitivity. When you're not on opioids, things hurt more because you're not producing the natural pain relievers that we would normally produce. So you can treat that through smoking. And let's put treat in quotes. You can treat that through smoking. I'm sorry, through nicotine. Nicotine has an acute pain relieving quality, so it's going to take that pain and lower it. And independently, it increases pain tolerance. So whatever pain is left, you can deal with better. And this is potentially why when a person is moved to heroin, which is there's a lot of barriers to entry to heroin, both criminal and as well as sort of psychological. People have to get over a fear of needles and the increased danger of needles in this environment. So not a lot of people use heroin, but once you're in that heroin category, 90% of them are also smoking. And there's a good chance that this is one of the main drivers of that. We know that because nicotine is a stimulant, and it is a stimulant that activates the parasympathetic nervous system, which is what controls peristalsis, which is what moves your food into your intestines and moves your food through your intestines and out of you. We know that nicotine can treat constipation in non-opioid using individuals. I haven't found an experiment where they studied this particular effect in opioid users, but I think that we can hypothesize that it might be playing a role until science decides to speak on it. Obviously, opioids cause sleepiness, drowsiness, a lack of attention. We've already talked that nicotine is a stimulant that addresses those things. This final one is interesting, and I do not want to speculate about what benefit a person is actually experiencing here, but it's worth pointing out and good knowledge for you all to have. And that is that smoking, this last one is a smoking thing. Smoking speeds opioid clearance, right? So what that means is you take in opioids, it's metabolized by the body, right? How quickly does it get out of you? The longer it's in you and being not metabolized, the more danger its presence presents. So speeding it up might serve some beneficial functions. But I'll tell you that it does this. So when you smoke, again, this is one of those situations where we can get really biological and really wonky really quick. Most drugs, about 65 to 70% of them, are metabolized in what's called the CYP450 system. All right, so that is a part of the liver system. So about 80% of all drugs are metabolized by the liver, and about 80% of those are metabolized by CYP450. That's a group of enzymes. Tobacco smoke specifically activates an enzyme called 1A2. And all of these drugs are also metabolized by 1A2. So when you smoke, your body says, oh gosh, we need a bunch of 1A2. It floods the body with 1A2. And as a consequence, these drugs also get metabolized more rapidly, sometimes up to 2 or 3 times more rapidly, which means that in order to get the same therapeutic benefit from these drugs, a person might have to take up to twice as much of them. And if you know a lot of the ones we've listed here, because we're the behavioral health and wellness program, are the behavioral health drugs, right? These are your antipsychotics, your anxiolytics, your antidepressants, right? So imagine if you needed twice as much haloperidol. Like, these are drugs with significant side effects, really side effects leading to metabolic syndrome, over-sedatedness, all sorts of bad news bears stuff. But it's not just like super sensitive drugs like haloperidol, it's also insulin, right? And there's a big deal about how costly insulin is. Imagine if you needed twice as much, or imagine if you're a smoker and by quitting smoking, you could have to buy half as much, thinking of it in the sort of positive spin way. It's also caffeine, acetaminophen, right? Tylenol. Like, this is an important component. This is also true, and it doesn't seem to be true because of 1A2. There's a host of enzymes here. 3A4, I think, is the one that methadone is metabolized by. But and there is a really good case study here about a gentleman who was put on methadone maintenance treatment for his opioid use disorder, voluntarily cut his own cigarettes back from 20 cigarettes a day to 10, and ended up in the emergency department for methadone toxicity, opioid toxicity with methadone. This is a potentially life-threatening issue. Now, I think the most immediate conclusion here is, well, that gentleman should just keep smoking. No, no, no. That's not the direction we want to go. What we want to do is reduce that person's methadone back to the natural clearance rate. He has reduced his smoking by half, so we're going to reduce the methadone by half. This is highlighted here is the one part of the conclusion of the authors of that particular paper. We just as another note about how this relationship, we've explored this more in the years since, and this paper is really good too. And it found a connection between nicotine replacement therapy as delivered in a patch, alleviating the discomforts of methadone withdrawal, and methadone relieving the discomforts of nicotine withdrawal. So we can actually imagine a virtuous cycle of these two drugs in an orchestrated alliance to step down successfully from both, provided that the people who are in charge of that methadone maintenance know this, right? And know enough to use the drugs this way. One of the big complaints about methadone from, granted, like famous people with anecdotes about their own experience on methadone, is that people go to methadone and they just stay on methadone the rest of their life. We haven't really come up with a good solution for having people step off of methadone and not relapse back to uncontrolled or illicit opioids. This might be a promising avenue. So there are a lot of harms associated with opioids, more than we normally think about, especially in this bottom right-hand corner. We tend to think about the deaths from respiratory depression, fatal overdose due to respiratory depression. But what we didn't used to have prior to the development of OxyContin were long-term opioid users. Now we have a lot of long-term opioid users. And what we're seeing is that if they don't end up misusing their drugs and dying of overdose, they have an increase of overall mortality through a variety of mechanisms, chief of being cardiovascular damage, see myocardial infarction there, cancer, increased cancer risk, and immunosuppression, leading to all sorts of additional infections, including respiratory infections. Respiratory infections, particularly being a top 5 killer already. Cerebrovascular disease being number 1 killer, cancer being number 2. So these are the things that are leading to the other big things. These are all the things that cigarettes make worse, or that tobacco makes worse. Almost all of them, including a greater chance that person is going to develop the addiction or dependence that's going to lead to the misuse, that's going to lead to these other things. Right. So again, once we think about our prevention strategies, if we want to lock people into at least using their drugs appropriately, we need to get rid of the additional risk proposed by tobacco use. From a treatment perspective, and I'm not going to dwell on this because y'all aren't treatment specialists. I don't think most of you are. But if you're working with systems, this is the kind of knowledge that you might want to go into those systems with. And this is what you might be looking for. The first one is, if you're going to a substance use treatment facility, they're going to be screening for drug use for sure. Are they screening for tobacco? And are they using a validated instrument that can point them toward problematic use of the drugs that they're not thinking about? Because even if it's like an opioid treatment center, they might really have a great tool for analyzing or for assessing opioid use and problematic opioid use. But are they looking at other drugs at all? Because in order to treat that opioid use, it doesn't matter if it's nicotine or not. They need to be treating that other drug too. If that other drug is benzodiazepines, really common co-use substance with opioids, they need to be detecting that problematic use as well. The two I put on the board are pretty good. The WHO's assist to the WHO. Nobody says it. Nobody says the WHO, but it's the World Health Organization. The WHO's assist tool, very good. But the last time I checked, it's a pen and paper version only. That's not real attractive. It takes a long time. It requires typically a staff member to go through that with the client. That's a labor cost that sometimes they can't bear. So TAPS, not quite as good at detecting problematic use. It's good, it's not great, but it does have a tabletized version and a self filler outer tool that the patients can use themselves if they're capable of doing it. Next is making sure that the staff have tobacco competency. If they have licensed professionals, that could be an LCSW, an LPC, a certified addictions treatment specialist, certified addictions counselor here in Colorado. 95%, I'm confident they can do tobacco treatment, but sometimes they don't think they can. So sometimes just a matter of assuring them that the modalities they've been educated on that they use every day, like cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavior treatment or therapy, motivational interviewing, these all work for whatever substance they're already treating, whatever mental health condition they're already treating, and also tobacco. But if it's generally true that they just don't feel comfortable doing it, they don't want to engage in the conversation, they don't know how to navigate or lead those conversations, let's get them trained up. And you can always send them back to me. Training takes 1 to 3 days plus testing, maybe 4 days, depends on the intensity of services they want to provide. And then it's just a matter of them inside their systems working with a clinical supervisor or something like that. I put these two bottom things on here under systemic dimensions of treatment involving family members. That's an evidence-based strategy, especially for kids. Adolescents is getting their family members involved. But sometimes there might be organizational barriers to that. And similarly with working in community and wraparound services, these are really good evidence-based strategies, but sometimes there are organizational barriers to doing it. A person just doesn't have the time. They don't have a company vehicle. They don't have the right relationships with contracted services for like respite care, those sorts of things. So that's a situation where you'd want to be recommending that they engage in this, but you might need to look for those organizational barriers. That's why I put them on the systemic slide. From the clinical standpoint, the things that we're looking for is, are people using a trauma-informed approach? Generally speaking, this is becoming more and more and more popular, and people are really looking for it. The thing is, we should just assume that trauma exists in our clients. And that's especially true when we're looking at somebody who is using 2 or more drugs. It's just the odds go way up, and you're never going to hurt anybody by using a trauma-informed approach. You're never going to hurt anybody by being more sympathetic, being more respectful, by engaging them in their own decision-making regarding their treatment plan, by making them feel safer and more secure, right? You're just that's never going to hurt. But what it might mean that gets people maybe to the edges of their scope of practice, because if their job is not to identify types of trauma, if their job is not to treat trauma, they should still be on the lookout for it. And then once people spot it, then they have a tendency to want to engage with it rather than make those referrals. And what they need to be doing is looking for signs of trauma. They need to be educated on how to spot trauma in their clinical encounters, and then making sure to direct people to the proper service providers. But we know that trauma is, and ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, are leading, they're way upstream to tobacco use. So we want to be making sure that all of our staff are trained in at least identifying trauma. We want to work with the client to identify their interrelatedness. And the first step of that is to do the cost-benefit analysis thingy that I did earlier today, right? Think about the 2 drugs or more that they're using. How do they physiologically work together? Are both of them stimulants? Are one's a stimulant and one's a sedative? And then use whatever knowledge you have to just lead a conversation with the client to get them to talk about what it's like for them, and the reason to use those drugs individually and together. And we need to do that because, again, to treat any drug use, we need to understand how that drug is being used in concert with other drugs, or in concert with their emotions and their moods and their thought patterns, all those things. It's just all part of the piece. But to hear them say, I would miss the cigarette after my marijuana, then that allows us to equip them through education and coping skills to be able to step away from tobacco, even though they'll miss it. Let them grieve, right? But we have to have them articulate it first so that we can address it. We do want to treat the causes of the disease, and that's going to actually lead us to the bottom bullet point, which is to say that when we have somebody in treatment and we send them back home, it's back to the home that either cultivated or maintained a drug user. So we have to make sure that we're integrating treatment into their process, and not just treating the drug use, waiting through their detox period and then sending them home. We have to actually go through the counseling process. Use medication-assisted therapy when it's available. It's not available for every drug, but what I want to emphasize here is making sure that nicotine replacement therapy, bupropion and varenicline, are on the MAT list of the substance use treatment facilities that we're working with. NRT, bupropion, and varenicline is MAT, and a lot of substance use treatment facilities do not think of it that way, but they absolutely need to, and the case is extremely easy to make. If you are out there prompting that discussion and you're getting any sort of pushback and you want help, reach out to me. I can talk about it literally all day. And then what we have generally said in the past is that motivational interviewing and cognitive behavioral therapy are the two evidence-based modalities for tobacco treatment. Full stop. That's what the Surgeon General says. On the horizon are the two on the board. That's dialectical behavior therapy and integrated CBT, integrated cognitive behavioral therapy. If you know what CBT is, integrated CBT is just that plus mindfulness-based exercises, breathing, breath work, visualizations, guided meditations, that sort of stuff. Most of your CBT practitioners are doing this, even if they don't know that that's what we're calling it now. And DBT, we already use with adolescents with emotional dysregulation, and we already use it for adults and adolescents with non-nicotine related drugs. There are a couple studies that support its use for nicotine or for tobacco cessation, and the Surgeon General cited those studies in the Tobacco Cessation 2019 report, but more are just going to keep coming. That is going to be an evidence-based standard because we already know it's an evidence-based standard for drug use, and nicotine is a drug. It's going to transfer. That's speculation on my part, but I'm really confident in it. And that is actually it for me today. I know that was a whole bunch, but I hope that at least some of it was valuable, and if not valuable, at least interesting. But if you have any comments or questions or suggestions, I'm happy to take those. DBT is dialectical behavior therapy. So it confuses me every time. It's cognitive behavioral therapy, but it's dialectical behavior therapy. And it's specific. It is specific to looking at social disengagement, emotional dysregulation, and addressing those things. So it really does work at like that sort of precursor to drug use moment, so that people can control their emotions and thereby not become subject to their cravings. Yes, it is being recorded, and later today, depending on the rest of my schedule, later today or tomorrow, I'll have it up on YouTube. I'll send out the email at that point. It will also be available on the grantee website, where all these things end up, hopefully. TFCO, that's the word I wanted. Tobacco-free CO. Thank you, Jennifer. Yeah, absolutely. You're all welcome. Thanks for attending. Good. All right. Well, if nobody has any questions, I'll go ahead and end the meeting, and you have 7 minutes to do whatever you need to do before your next thing. All right. Bye, everybody.
Thank you. That was awesome.